A flight attendant kicked a family off a plane. Just 4 minutes later, she was fired in front of everyone. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It all started on a busy afternoon flight from New York to Miami. The family, father, mother, and 2 kids, boarded the plane with no issues. They found their seats, settled in, and prepared for the long flight ahead. But things quickly took a strange turn when the flight attendant approached them. At first, it seemed like a routine interaction, just a few words exchanged about the seating arrangement. But what happened next shocked everyone on board. The flight attendant, visibly frustrated, asked the family to get off the plane. The family was confused and tried to explain that there was no real problem. They hadn't done anything wrong. Yet, the flight attendant insisted, saying they were being removed due to a situation that no one had quite understood. The family asked to speak to the captain, but the attendant refused. Tensions were rising. The father, trying to stay calm, politely asked why they were being asked to leave. The attendant didn't answer directly, only repeating that they had to go. The situation became more heated by the minute. The other passengers were watching, some whispering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. What started as a simple misunderstanding had quickly turned into something much more. The tension in the cabin was thick, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. As the family gathered their things and walked toward the exit, a few passengers started to speak up. One woman raised her hand and asked the flight attendant why the family was being removed. The attendant didn't answer her, instead telling the woman to mind her own business. Other passengers murmured in agreement, their eyes shifting between the flight attendant and the family. They could sense something wasn't right. The father tried to calm the situation, but the flight attendant was relentless, pushing them toward the door. When they reached the jet bridge, one of the children, a young girl, began to cry. The mother knelt down, trying to reassure her. It was clear that no one on the plane understood what was happening, but the situation was spiraling out of control. The passengers continued to look on, some clearly uncomfortable, others shaking their heads in disbelief. At that point, the flight attendant went back into the plane, but her actions were far from over. There was a brief pause, and then the captain appeared. No one knew exactly what was said, but the whispers started again. Some passengers guessed the captain had intervened. Others thought maybe it was a misunderstanding after all. But the family was still off the plane, and the tension was palpable. As the family stood outside, waiting for answers, the rest of the passengers were left wondering, how could something so simple escalate so quickly? Minutes passed, and still no one knew exactly what had happened. The family was standing just outside the plane, trying to make sense of the situation. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Passengers were talking amongst themselves, some quietly questioning the flight attendant's actions. One woman, who had witnessed the entire exchange, turned to the person next to her and said, "That was uncalled for. No one should be treated like that." Several others nodded in agreement, though no one seemed brave enough to speak up directly to the flight attendant. The flight attendants in the cabin seemed to be avoiding eye contact with the passengers. A few moments later, there was an announcement from the captain. He spoke calmly but firmly. "We apologize for the inconvenience, but there will be a slight delay. We are addressing an issue outside the plane." No further details were given. The passengers exchanged confused looks. They had no idea what was really going on, but it didn't feel like a normal delay. The cabin grew quieter as people waited for something to happen. They were all left wondering why the family was kicked off, and why they were still stuck at the gate with no clear answers. Then, something unexpected occurred. A few minutes after the announcement, the door to the cockpit opened, and the flight attendant returned. But this time she wasn't walking down the aisle with her usual confidence. She was visibly nervous, her face flushed red. She paused by the front of the plane, speaking briefly with the other flight attendants before walking up to the intercom. What she said next left everyone in shock. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that the situation earlier has been resolved. However, I am no longer part of this flight crew. I have been relieved of my duties. A heavy silence filled the cabin. No one could believe what they'd just heard. Passengers glanced at each other, trying to make sense of the sudden turn of events. The attendant's words had barely sunk in when the cabin door opened again. This time, it wasn't the family returning, but a senior airline manager and a security guard. They walked down the aisle, heading straight for the flight attendant. The passengers watched as the manager spoke briefly with the flight attendant. The words weren't clear, but the body language was unmistakable. She was being escorted off the plane. The security guard stayed close, making sure there were no further disruptions. As the flight attendant passed by the seats, she kept her eyes down, avoiding any direct interaction with the passengers. The tension in the cabin was thick. No one expected this outcome. It wasn't just a matter of a simple removal of a passenger. The attendant was now being publicly escorted off the plane, right in front of everyone who had witnessed the incident. As she reached the door, the manager gave one final instruction. "Please exit the plane." The attendant nodded silently and left, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted again, this time in a mix of confusion and quiet disbelief. Passengers exchanged glances, some still unsure whether what they had seen was real. What had started as a simple seating issue had now escalated into something far more dramatic. Yet, there was still no clear explanation of why it had happened, or why the attendant had been fired so suddenly. The silence in the cabin lingered for what felt like an eternity. No one moved, and for a moment, it seemed like time had frozen. The passengers were still processing what had just happened. Some were whispering, others simply staring at the empty spot where the flight attendant had stood just moments before. Everyone on board had questions, but no one had answers. How could a simple misunderstanding lead to such an extreme outcome? Why had the flight attendant been removed so suddenly? And why wasn't the family brought back onto the plane? After a few moments, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time with a more reassuring tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are doing everything we can to get this flight back on track. We'll be underway shortly." But the words did little to ease the tension in the cabin. Passengers weren't just frustrated by the delay anymore. They were confused by what they had witnessed. What had truly happened behind the scenes? Why hadn't the airline given a proper explanation? The truth was, no one really knew. The minutes dragged on as the cabin crew moved about, trying to maintain order. A few passengers got up to stretch, while others continued to whisper quietly to one another. A couple of people tried to get the attention of the flight attendants who had remained on board, but they were quickly redirected to their seats. They weren't going to get any more information, at least not right then. It seemed clear that the airline was trying to move past the situation as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, outside the plane, the family was still waiting. They had been left in the dark just as much as the passengers. They had no idea why they'd been asked to leave or why the situation had escalated so quickly. They had hoped for some kind of explanation from the airline, but so far, there had been nothing. The father paced back and forth, visibly frustrated. The mother tried to comfort the kids who were still upset by the entire experience. It was clear that they just wanted to get home, but now they were left standing in the airport, unsure of what would happen next. Back inside the plane, the passengers continued to speculate. Some thought the flight attendant had been too harsh. Others believed the family had been in the wrong. But everyone agreed on one thing. The way it had all played out didn't sit right. The situation had gone from an innocent disagreement to a public firing, all within minutes. It was unusual, unsettling, and left a lot of people wondering if there was more to the story than anyone had been told. Still, the flight had to continue, and the clock was ticking. There was a growing sense that whatever had happened was only the beginning of a much larger story. As the minutes stretched on, it became clear that the flight wasn't going to take off anytime soon. The passengers, still reeling from what they'd just witnessed, were starting to talk openly about what had happened. Some were making guesses about the flight attendant's behavior. Was she having a bad day? Was there something more personal going on behind the scenes? Others, more outraged, wondered if the family had been treated unfairly simply because of their race. The father had been calm, polite, and patient. It didn't make sense to them why things had escalated so quickly. A few passengers who had been sitting near the front of the plane reported hearing snippets of a conversation between the flight attendant and another crew member after she had returned from the gate. They had overheard a few words, something about procedures and protocols, but it was hard to make out the rest. It didn't help to clarify the situation, though it added another layer of mystery to the whole thing. Had the flight attendant been following some sort of policy, or had she acted out of line in some way? No one knew for sure. The airline staff seemed to be avoiding questions from the passengers, and every time someone tried to ask about the situation, they were met with a vague response. "We're handling it," one of the flight attendants said, but it didn't feel reassuring. Instead, it made people feel like they were being brushed off. The more the passengers tried to figure it out, the more unclear everything seemed. And then, just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any stranger, the airline made another announcement. This time, it wasn't just about the delay or apologizing for the inconvenience. It was an announcement that the captain would be stepping off the plane to meet with higher-ups. The flight was delayed indefinitely, and it seemed like the airline needed time to sort everything out. But why? What was so complicated about this situation that it required the captain to leave? The passengers were left with more questions than answers. Back outside, the family still hadn't received any answers either. They were waiting, unsure of what was coming next. They hadn't been told whether they could reboard or if they were going to be booked on a different flight. Their entire trip had been thrown into chaos. The father had tried to call the airline's customer service, but had only been given vague responses about a situation and investigations. The more they waited, the more they realized they might not get a clear explanation anytime soon. The family just wanted to get home, but the longer they stood there, the more they began to feel like they were being treated like criminals for something they hadn't even done. Inside the plane, the passengers were still talking. Whispers filled the air as more people began to openly speculate about what had really happened. The more they talked, the more it became clear. This wasn't just an ordinary dispute. This was something bigger. People were beginning to wonder if they had witnessed an airline employee being punished for something that hadn't even been fully explained. How could someone be fired so publicly, without any clear reason, and in front of so many passengers? Was this an isolated incident, or was there something more to it? With no real answers and tensions rising, it seemed like the only thing everyone on the plane could agree on was that something wasn't right. Something had gone terribly wrong, and no one knew yet how it would all end. As the minutes turned into an hour, the sense of unease only grew. The flight attendants had returned to their usual positions, but there was an air of discomfort among them. Passengers were no longer just talking in hushed tones. They were outright discussing what had just unfolded, trying to piece together the puzzle with the few scraps of information they had. Some believed the flight attendant had acted out of anger. Others thought it was a power play. A few passengers started to voice concerns that the removal of the family wasn't a mistake at all, but an act driven by bias. The speculation began to grow, and the questions only became more pointed. Was this a case of racial discrimination? Had the family been targeted because of their skin color? Or was there something else going on behind the scenes that no one knew about? The airline's response to the situation only added to the confusion. A few minutes later, the captain returned to the plane, but instead of directly addressing the passengers, he briefly spoke to the remaining flight crew. It was clear that something serious had happened, but the details were still being kept under wraps. As he moved past the rows of seats, some passengers tried to get his attention, but he didn't make eye contact with anyone. He walked straight to the cockpit without stopping. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, leaving everyone wondering what was going on behind that door. Why wasn't the captain talking to the passengers directly? Was it because the situation was more complicated than anyone realized? As more time passed, the delay grew longer. The cabin crew was visibly anxious, exchanging quick words and passing notes between each other. The passengers, now growing restless, started questioning whether they would ever get the answers they deserved. They couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened, a mistake, or perhaps an error in judgment, and no one was owning up to it. The longer they waited, the more they felt like they were being left in the dark. Back at the gate, the family's frustration was palpable. The father had now spoken to several airline staff members, all of whom seemed to be giving him different answers. One person said they were working on rebooking them. Another said they needed to wait for the airline's investigation to finish. Yet no one could offer any clarity on why the family had been removed from the plane in the first place. It was as if they were being punished for something they still didn't understand. The more the father pressed, the more the responses seemed like they were designed to delay him, to avoid answering the real question: why were they kicked off in the first place? By now, the airline's security team had begun walking through the airport terminal. They were taking notice of the family, perhaps preparing for the possibility that they would need to be escorted out of the terminal as well. The family was now isolated, standing off to the side, their children clinging to their sides, both exhausted and emotionally drained from what had already been a long, confusing ordeal. The mother had done her best to comfort them, but it was clear the entire experience was taking a toll. How could something as simple as boarding a flight end like this? They hadn't done anything wrong, but now they were stuck in an airport with no answers, no direction, and no way of knowing when, or if, they would get home. Back inside the plane, passengers were growing restless. They were starting to piece together their own theories. Some suspected the airline was trying to cover up the incident by keeping everything vague. Others believed that the flight attendant's firing was a result of a larger, internal issue within the airline. Maybe she had acted recklessly, maybe not. Either way, it was hard to ignore the unsettling feeling that the entire situation had been mishandled from the start. Why hadn't the airline explained things? Why had they allowed this to spiral into such chaos? Just as the tension reached its peak, the airline made another announcement, but this time, it wasn't a general statement. This time, it was directed at the passengers. We understand that there has been a lot of confusion regarding today's events. We appreciate your patience as we address the matter at hand. Please bear with us as we finalize the next steps for the flight. That was all. No further details. The uncertainty hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Would they take off soon? Would the family be allowed back on? Or was this just the beginning of something much bigger that no one was ready for? In the terminal, the family was beginning to realize the full weight of the situation. This wasn't just a flight delay anymore. This was an experience that would leave them questioning what had happened to them, why they were treated the way they had been, and whether they would ever get the closure they needed. No one was talking about it openly, but in the background, a conversation was taking place. A conversation about what had really happened and who was responsible. As the minutes dragged on, the passengers inside the plane could feel the weight of the tension hanging in the air. The flight attendants had become even more reserved, offering only short, polite responses to any questions from the passengers. It was as if the entire crew was operating on autopilot, unsure how to handle the situation. No one was asking for much, just an explanation. But every time someone tried to ask what had happened, they were either met with silence or a vague statement about protocol and investigation. It was clear to everyone on board that something had gone horribly wrong, but the airline wasn't willing to offer any clarity. This was a situation where the more the passengers tried to understand, the more they felt shut out. In the terminal, the family's situation was no better. They had been isolated for nearly 2 hours at this point, with no clear direction or answers from the airline. The father was frustrated, but he was doing his best to keep his calm. He had approached every airline employee he could find, trying to get some kind of solid information. The airline staff, however, seemed to be deliberately avoiding him. Each time he asked for details about what had happened, he was told to wait for a manager or directed to another department. But no one was willing to offer any explanation as to why they had been removed from the plane. Were they being rebooked? Were they allowed to get back on? The answers he received were always the same. We're handling it. The more the family waited, the more they began to feel like they were being ignored, or worse, like they were being treated as if they were the problem. They had done nothing wrong. They had followed every rule. But now they were stuck, stranded at an airport, while the airline seemed to pretend nothing had happened. The father, now visibly exasperated, pulled out his phone and called the airline's customer service line. He was transferred several times, each representative offering the same vague answers. Each one repeating, "We are investigating the matter." After more than 20 minutes on the phone, the father finally snapped, "How long is this investigation going to take? I need answers. We've been waiting for hours." But once again, the response was a non-committal. "I understand your frustration, sir. Please bear with us." At this point, the father was at his wit's end. He hung up and looked around the terminal, feeling a growing sense of helplessness. How could they be treated like this? They were passengers on a flight, not criminals, yet they had been kicked off the plane without explanation and were now being treated like they didn't even matter. Back inside the plane, the passengers were starting to feel the effects of the prolonged delay. The flight attendants were doing their best to keep things calm, but there was an undeniable sense of discomfort. People weren't just confused anymore, they were angry. They had witnessed the flight attendant being removed in a humiliating public fashion. They had seen the family escorted off the plane, and many of them had silently agreed that something wasn't right. But no one knew exactly what had gone wrong, and the lack of communication was making everything worse. Some passengers started to voice their concerns more openly. One woman, sitting near the front of the plane, stood up and raised her voice. "Why hasn't anyone told us what happened?" she asked, her frustration clear. "We're just sitting here, waiting, while you're all treating us like we're in the dark. We have a right to know what's going on." Her words seemed to echo what everyone else was feeling. The passengers had been left in limbo for far too long, and now they were starting to question the airline's handling of the situation. Was the flight attendant fired for good reason, or was this some sort of corporate cover-up? And why had the family been kicked off the plane in the first place? Everyone was wondering if they were witnessing the aftermath of something far bigger than they could have imagined. The flight crew, visibly uncomfortable, tried to calm the passengers down, but they had little to offer. It was becoming increasingly clear that the airline was doing everything they could to sweep the incident under the rug. The more the passengers demanded answers, the more they were met with vague responses and empty promises. "Please be patient," one of the attendants said, repeating the company line. But patience was wearing thin, and many of the passengers had stopped believing that the airline had any intention of addressing the situation in a meaningful way. Outside, the family's frustration was reaching its peak. The father had spoken to a manager at the counter, but the answers had been just as unclear as before. The manager had said, "We are conducting an internal review," but that didn't explain why they had been removed in the first place, or why they were still stranded at the airport. The family had been through enough. They were exhausted, angry, and ready to go home. But with every passing minute, it seemed less and less likely that they would make it to Miami anytime soon. Suddenly, a new wave of confusion hit when the airline manager reappeared, this time with a clipboard in hand. He approached the family, who were still standing by the gate, waiting for any sign of what would happen next. "We need to discuss what's going to happen," he said. The family was on edge, unsure if this meant they would finally get some answers, or if they would simply be dismissed once again. The manager motioned for them to follow him to a private area, and for the first time in hours, it looked like they might finally get some clarity. But the question remained: what was really going on? Would they ever know the truth behind the events that had turned their simple flight into an ordeal? The tension between the family and the airline staff was palpable as the manager led them through the terminal. The father, trying to hold back his frustration, walked closely behind the manager, his mind racing with questions. What was going to happen now? Would they finally be told what had led to their removal from the plane? Or was this just another attempt to delay and divert attention from the real issue? The family followed quietly, the mother holding her children's hands tightly, trying to reassure them despite the uncertainty in the air. They were led to a small private room near the gate, far from the prying eyes of other passengers. The manager motioned for them to sit down, but there was no real warmth in his gesture. The family took their seats, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The manager sat across from them, glanced down at his clipboard, and began speaking in a flat, impersonal tone. "I understand this has been frustrating for you," he began. "We apologize for the inconvenience. However, the decision to remove you from the flight was made due to what we considered a safety concern." The words hung in the air, but they made no sense to the family. Safety concern? There had been no altercation, no violence, no signs of disruption. The father spoke up. "Safety concern? Are you serious? We didn't do anything wrong. There was no reason to kick us off the plane. Why are we being treated like criminals?" His voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief, but he was trying to keep his emotions in check. The manager, however, didn't flinch. He simply repeated his earlier statement, as though it were a script he had been trained to follow. "We take these matters seriously. I'm sure you can understand that the crew must act swiftly if there is any potential threat," the manager said, his eyes focused on his clipboard. His tone was clinical, devoid of any real empathy. The family's confusion only deepened. The father's frustration mounted as he asked, "What exactly was the threat? You can't just say we were a safety concern without explaining what that means." But the manager didn't answer directly. Instead, he avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "There are protocols," he muttered, as if that was all that needed to be said. It was clear now. There were no answers coming. The father's patience was running out. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edges of the chair. "This doesn't make sense. We were just trying to get on our flight, and now we're stuck here with no explanation. We've been treated horribly. How is this acceptable?" The manager finally looked up, his eyes cold but unwavering. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the father cut him off. "You still haven't told us why we were removed. What's going on here?" The manager paused, looking like he was considering whether to say more. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke again. "I can't give you all the details, but I'll tell you this much. The flight attendant who made the decision to remove you is no longer with the company." The words hit like a punch. The father blinked, unsure if he had heard right. "What do you mean she's no longer with the company?" he asked, his voice rising. The manager's face remained unreadable, his eyes locked on the clipboard in front of him. "She's been terminated," he said, his tone flat. "The airline cannot comment further on the specifics of her termination, but it was done in accordance with company policy." The family sat in stunned silence. The weight of the revelation hung in the room. The flight attendant had been fired, but the family still had no idea why. The questions continued to pile up, but the answers only grew more confusing. Why had she been fired? What had she done to deserve such a severe consequence? The manager didn't provide any more information, instead repeating his earlier apologies and offering vague reassurances about the airline's commitment to customer service. But those words felt hollow. The family could see through the corporate rhetoric. They had been treated unfairly, and no amount of scripted apologies could make up for the humiliation they had endured. Meanwhile, outside the small room, the passengers from the flight were still waiting. They had been given no new information, but the delay was starting to get to them. It was becoming clear that something had gone wrong, but no one on the plane had received any concrete answers. They had heard the announcement about the flight attendant's firing, but that only added to the mystery. The passengers began to wonder, what had truly happened between the flight attendant and the family? What had caused the situation to escalate in such an extreme way? Back in the private room, the father's mind was racing. His frustration was now mixed with a sense of disbelief. He had expected an explanation, but all he had received were more questions. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice softer but still filled with frustration. The manager, showing no signs of sympathy, glanced at his clipboard once more. "We'll rebook your flight," he said, offering the first piece of concrete information since they had been removed from the plane. "You'll be on the next available flight. We apologize again for the inconvenience, and we hope to resolve this matter as soon as possible." The family was still in shock. It didn't feel like a resolution. It felt like they were being swept aside, forced to move on without ever truly understanding why they had been treated the way they had. The father stood up slowly, looking at the manager one last time. "I just want to know why," he said quietly. "I want to know why you kicked us off that plane." But the manager didn't answer. He simply nodded, signaling the end of the conversation. The family left the room, still without answers, still without closure. Outside the room, the passengers had begun to grow even more restless. Whispers were now louder, more pointed. Many were still wondering what had really happened. The idea that something had gone wrong on that flight was becoming harder to ignore. But for now, all anyone had were questions. Questions that, for the time being, would go unanswered. The airline had managed to keep its story under wraps, but the longer this situation dragged on, the more people would wonder if there was something deeper they weren't being told. The only thing that was clear was that this wasn't over. Far from it. As the family walked back through the terminal, their minds were racing with confusion and frustration. The father held his children close, trying to keep them calm, though it was clear that the situation had taken its toll on all of them. The mother was quiet, her mind working overtime, trying to process everything that had just happened. They had been removed from the plane without explanation, then shuffled into a private room where the airline manager gave them more vague responses. Now they were left with no real answers, only more questions. The promise of being rebooked on another flight didn't feel like much of a resolution. How could they just move on from something so unjust, something so humiliating, when they hadn't even been told why it had happened? They were directed to a customer service desk, where a clerk quickly began processing their new flight details. But the father couldn't focus on the new flight arrangements. His thoughts kept drifting back to the scene on the plane. What had gone wrong? Why had the flight attendant acted so harshly? And why had she been fired so abruptly? The more he thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. There had been no obvious confrontation, no obvious reason for her to act with such aggression. In fact, the family had been polite, respectful, even understanding when the flight attendant first approached them about the seating issue. Nothing made sense. The more he tried to make sense of it, the more it felt like something was being hidden from them. At the customer service desk, the clerk handed the family their new boarding passes, though she didn't make eye contact with them. It was as if she were going through the motions, simply doing her job without acknowledging the gravity of the situation. She didn't apologize or offer any sympathy. She just gave them the passes and turned back to her computer. The father glanced at the boarding passes in his hand, feeling a sick knot form in his stomach. They were now rebooked, but nothing about this felt right. It felt like they were just being pushed along, moved out of the way, so that the airline could sweep the incident under the rug. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. This was something far deeper, something that went beyond just a bad interaction between a passenger and a flight attendant. And they weren't going to walk away without answers. The family made their way toward the gate for the new flight, but their minds were still stuck on the unanswered questions. They had been treated like criminals, removed from a plane in front of everyone, humiliated, and then given nothing but empty apologies. Why had the flight attendant acted the way she had? Why had she been fired in such a dramatic and public manner? Was this just a case of an employee losing control? Or was there something more sinister at play? Back in the terminal, the passengers from the original flight were still lingering, some pacing, others sitting in small groups whispering to each other. They had all witnessed the same events, and now they were trying to piece together what had really happened. Some were still talking about the flight attendant's firing, speculating whether it was justified. Had she made a mistake? Or was this a larger issue that the airline was trying to cover up? The more they discussed, the more they realized that no one really knew the full story. The airline had offered no clarity, no real explanation, and now everyone was left to fill in the blanks. One passenger, sitting near the gate, pulled out her phone and began searching online for any news about the incident. She found nothing. It was as if the event had been completely erased from the public eye. There were no articles, no social media posts, not even a mention of the incident. It felt almost as though the airline had scrubbed everything clean. The passenger tried searching for the flight attendant's name, but came up with nothing. No news, no social media profiles, not even a mention in the airline's public statements. It was as if the whole thing had been quietly swept under the rug. In the meantime, the family sat in silence, staring at their new boarding passes. The children, who had been quiet for most of the ordeal, finally spoke up. "Are we going to get on the plane now, Daddy?" the youngest asked. Her voice was small, uncertain. The father looked down at her, his heart heavy. How could he answer her? How could he tell her that everything was going to be fine when he didn't even know what had really happened? The mother squeezed her child's hand and whispered, "We'll be on the plane soon, sweetie. Just a little longer." But even she wasn't sure if that was true. How could they trust the airline when they hadn't even been told what had happened? How could they just sit down and forget what had transpired? They had been treated with such disregard, and now they were supposed to just get on the next flight as if nothing had happened? A few more minutes passed, and the family was finally called to board the flight. The father stood up, but before they could move toward the gate, he turned to the others. "Wait," he said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and resolve. "We're not just going to forget about this. We need answers." His wife nodded quietly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. They were all tired, emotionally drained, but the father wasn't ready to let this go. He couldn't walk away without knowing why their entire journey had been disrupted, why they had been treated like that. He turned back toward the customer service desk, his mind made up. "I need to speak with someone higher up," he said to the clerk, his voice firm now. The clerk looked at him blankly, but he repeated himself. "I need to speak to someone who knows what happened. I'm not leaving until I get an explanation." For a moment, the clerk hesitated. She glanced around, perhaps unsure of what to do, but eventually she nodded and picked up the phone. The father's heart pounded in his chest as he waited, his mind still racing. He wasn't going to let this slide, not this time. Not when his family had been treated so unfairly. As the minutes passed, the clerk spoke into the phone, her tone low. The family waited, but no one else in the terminal seemed to notice. They were caught up in their own world, their own worries, while the family sat in limbo, holding on to the hope that they might finally get the answers they deserved. And yet, the more the father thought about it, the more it seemed like this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something bigger was at play. This wasn't a simple case of bad customer service. This was a problem that ran deeper, and they weren't going to stop until they found out the truth. The family waited in tense silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, unsure of what to expect next. The father stood by the counter, his back stiff, his jaw clenched as he waited for the customer service clerk to return with some kind of answer. His mind raced with scenarios, each one more troubling than the last. Why had the flight attendant reacted the way she had? What had caused her to make the call to remove them from the plane? The more he thought about it, the less it made sense. There was no altercation, no shouting, no clear reason why they had been singled out in such a way. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from them, something that could change everything. The children sat quietly beside their mother, their faces etched with confusion. The younger daughter had been quiet ever since they were kicked off the plane, but now she was looking up at her father with wide eyes, still uncertain about what had just happened. The father could see the hurt in her eyes. She was too young to understand the complexities of the situation, but she could feel the tension. The entire experience had been jarring for them all, and it wasn't over yet. The father turned to his wife, who was sitting with the children, her face pale and tired. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry, baby," he whispered to her, his voice soft. "I know this isn't what we planned, but we have to get answers. We deserve to know why this happened." She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and exhaustion. "I know, I want this to be over," she said quietly. "But I agree. We need to know what went wrong." The father was about to say something more when the clerk returned. her expression slightly more serious than before. She gestured for them to follow her, and without a word, they followed her down the hallway, past the security checkpoint, and toward a small office tucked away in a corner of the airport. The family was led inside, and they were greeted by another airline representative, this time a man who appeared to be in his mid-40s. He wore a neatly pressed suit and had an air of authority about him. He stood up as they entered and extended his hand to the father. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice calm and composed, "I understand you've been through quite an ordeal today, and I want to assure you that we take these matters very seriously. I'm Brian Carter, the operations manager here at the airport. Please have a seat." The family sat down, though the father was still tense. He glanced at his wife, who nodded silently, and then turned to Brian Carter. "I'm not sure if you understand, but we've been through hell today. We were removed from our flight without explanation, and then told the flight attendant had been terminated. We were just trying to get on a plane, and now we're standing here with no answers. How is this possible?" Carter looked at them carefully, his gaze unwavering. "I truly understand your frustration, Mr. Miller, and I do apologize for the way things were handled earlier. I want to be clear. This situation is still under review, but I will share what I can." He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts before continuing. "The decision to remove you from the flight was made based on a report filed by the flight attendant, who believed there was a potential safety concern involving your family." "A safety concern?" the father repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "We weren't disruptive. We weren't even given a chance to explain ourselves. So why was that decision made? What was the actual concern?" Carter's expression remained calm, but the hesitation was evident. "There were concerns raised, Mr. Miller. However, I can't go into the full details of what was reported. There are some matters that are still being investigated internally. The flight attendant, based on her experience, made the call to remove your family for what she believed was a precautionary reason. She acted quickly because, in her view, the situation could escalate." "But there was no situation," the father interrupted, his frustration mounting. "We weren't causing any problems. No one was threatening anyone. You're telling me someone just decided we were a threat?" "I understand that this feels unjust," Carter responded, his tone firm but controlled. "But the flight attendant felt the need to act quickly, and the company has a protocol for addressing such concerns. It was a judgment call." The father shook his head. "This doesn't make sense. How is it that she made this call without any evidence, without trying to de-escalate the situation, or at least communicate with us before kicking us off?" Carter's eyes flickered slightly, but he didn't break eye contact. "I'm not here to defend her actions, Mr. Miller, but as I said, the flight attendant made a judgment call. She reported the incident, and after a review, the decision was made to terminate her employment. This is all part of an internal investigation, and we are doing everything we can to ensure that this kind of situation doesn't happen again." The room was heavy with silence after that. The father tried to absorb what he had just heard, but it felt like the more Carter explained, the less sense it made. Why was it that the flight attendant had acted so impulsively, and why had the company handled everything in such a secretive manner? It didn't feel like the airline was being open with them. It felt like they were trying to cover something up, trying to push this under the rug before it became a bigger issue. "And the firing," the father said, breaking the silence. "You're telling me she was fired because of this? Because she thought we were a threat?" Carter paused for a long moment before responding. "The termination was due to a combination of factors, Mr. Miller. It wasn't just the incident on the plane. It was how the situation was handled. The crew members on board, as well as the passengers, did not feel that her actions were in line with company policy. The airline is committed to upholding a high standard of customer service, and this behavior was not acceptable. But beyond that, I'm afraid I can't give you more specific details." The father felt a knot tighten in his chest. It still didn't add up. There was too much missing. The airline's response to the situation felt like a reaction to the public fallout, not a genuine effort to address what had gone wrong. The more they were told, the less they understood. "So what happens now?" the father asked, his voice quieter but still tinged with frustration. You expect us to just walk away from this? You want us to forget that we were humiliated, kicked off the plane, and treated like criminals for no reason? Carter looked at them with what seemed like genuine regret, but there was still a disconnect. I know this situation is difficult, but all I can offer is my deepest apologies. We will make sure you're rebooked on the next available flight, and we'll continue our internal investigation into what happened. If there's anything more we can do to make this right, we will. But beyond that, I can't provide further details at this time. The family sat there in stunned silence. It felt like the conversation had gone in circles, offering more frustration than answers. They weren't leaving with any closure, just more uncertainty and a lingering feeling that they had been wronged, not just by the flight attendant, but by the system that had allowed her behavior to escalate. The father stood up, his eyes still locked on Carter, but there was no more energy in him for confrontation. "Thank you," he said, his voice tight, "but I still don't feel like this is over." And with that, the family left the office, still uncertain of what had truly happened, and with no real sense of closure. The airline might have made its moves to smooth things over, but it was clear to the family that this story was far from finished. The family stepped out of the small office and into the bustling terminal, but it felt as though they had entered a completely different world. The noise of the airport, the chatter of other passengers, the hum of distant announcements, everything seemed muffled, as if the weight of what had just happened was pressing down on them. They walked in silence for a moment, the father holding on to the boarding passes with a sense of numb disbelief. The truth was, nothing had really been resolved. They still had no idea why they were removed from the plane, no clear answers, no sense of justice. All they had were vague statements, half-hearted apologies, and the unsettling feeling that something deeper was at play, something that was being deliberately hidden from them. The mother was the first to speak, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "What now? What do we do?" She looked over at her husband, her face tired, her eyes searching his for some kind of answer, but he had none. The father was still processing everything that had been said in the office. He couldn't shake the image of the flight attendant's sudden removal, the way she had been escorted off the plane as though she was the one who had done something wrong. How could an employee be fired so publicly without any clear reason? Why had she been so quick to act? And why had the airline made it all so secretive? "We just need to get on the plane," the father finally said, his voice hoarse. "Let's get through this. We'll figure it out later. We can't change what happened, but at least we can get home." His words were meant to reassure his family, but there was a hollow edge to them. The truth was, he didn't feel reassured. He didn't feel like everything was going to be okay. Not yet. As they made their way to the gate, the father couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with the airline representative. Carter's calm demeanor had only made things worse. It was clear that the airline wasn't interested in transparency. The way Carter had dodged questions, repeating the same corporate lines about protocol and investigation. It felt like they were trying to pacify him rather than address the core issue. The family had been removed from the flight without reason, and all they got in return was vague reassurances and a promise that the incident was being reviewed. What kind of review takes this long? Why hadn't they been given more clarity? And why, when the family had asked for answers, were they met with stonewalling at every turn? It didn't add up, and the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. They reached the gate for their rebooked flight, but it was still another hour before they could board. As they sat down, the father noticed other passengers from their original flight milling around. Some had been in the same position, watching the family get removed from the plane. He saw a couple of people glance at them, and he could tell that many of them were still trying to piece together what had happened. Some had been curious, others seemed sympathetic, but there was no way to know what they had really thought. It was possible that most of the passengers had simply wanted to put the whole thing behind them. Who would want to stay in the middle of something uncomfortable, especially when the airline was offering nothing but silence? The father's thoughts were interrupted by a man sitting nearby who leaned over and gave him a quick, cautious glance. The man seemed hesitant to speak at first, but after a moment he cleared his throat and asked, "Are you the family that got kicked off the flight earlier? I just wanted to say I saw what happened. I don't think you deserved that. I'm really sorry." The father looked at him, surprised. He hadn't expected anyone to speak up, especially not so openly. "Thanks," the father replied, his voice still tinged with frustration. "But we're still trying to figure out what happened, to be honest. We still don't know why we were removed." The man shook his head. "I don't know why either. But I was sitting near the front and I saw how the flight attendant acted. She was, I don't know, kind of abrupt. She didn't seem like she was trying to listen, just gave orders. The whole thing felt off." The father's heart sank. That was what he had suspected all along. The flight attendant hadn't just acted impulsively, she had acted without any consideration for what was actually going on. She had made a decision without even trying to de-escalate the situation, without trying to understand the family side of things. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a breakdown in communication. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like the flight attendant had been quick to judge, quick to make a decision that no one on the plane seemed to understand. "Did she seem like she had a reason?" the father asked, his voice sharp, though he tried to keep his composure. "Did she seem like she was following some protocol or just going off her own instincts?" The man hesitated, then shrugged. "Hard to say, but she didn't seem like she was following any protocol I've ever seen. It was like she just decided things were escalating and took matters into her own hands. I honestly think she overreacted, and it was the rest of us who ended up suffering because of it. That was it, wasn't it? The flight attendant had overreacted, and now, because of her decision, the family had been forced to deal with the consequences. They had been kicked off the plane in front of everyone, made to feel like criminals and left to sit in a terminal with no answers. It didn't seem fair. But the father knew that it wasn't just the flight attendant who had caused this. It was the airline too. They had failed to give them the proper explanation, to handle the situation in a professional way. The firing of the attendant, the vague statements from the airline, the lack of transparency, it all pointed to one thing. They were being left in the dark. And that, more than anything, made him angry. The conversation with the stranger ended as the gate agents began calling for boarding, and the family slowly got up to line up for the new flight. But even as they stood in line, the father couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that something bigger was at play. The airline had taken a step to remove the flight attendant, but that didn't fix the problem. The problem was much deeper. They had been unfairly treated, and now they needed to figure out what was truly going on. This wasn't just about a mistake that was made. This was about a system that failed them, and about a company that had yet to be held accountable. As they boarded the plane and took their seats, the father glanced out the window. The plane was ready to take off, but his mind wasn't. There were too many unanswered questions still lingering in his mind, and he wasn't going to stop searching for answers. This wasn't just about getting home. It was about making sure that what happened to them today didn't go unchallenged. They deserved to know the truth, and he was determined to find it, no matter how long it took. As the plane finally began to taxi down the runway, the hum of the engines seemed almost too calm compared to the storm of thoughts swirling in the father's mind. He had been hoping that boarding the new flight would bring some sense of relief, that maybe they could finally start to move on from the chaos. But the more he thought about everything that had happened, the way they were treated, the lack of answers, the coldness of the airline's responses, the more he realized that he couldn't just let it go. It wasn't just about getting home anymore. It was about justice. It was about understanding what went wrong and why, and making sure no one else had to go through what they did. The family settled into their seats as the plane took off, the lights of the airport slowly shrinking below them. The kids, still quiet from the shock of the entire day, eventually fell into a light sleep. The mother leaned back in her seat, her eyes closed, trying to block out the thoughts that had been racing through her mind all day. The father sat there, his eyes focused out the window, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't stop replaying the scene over and over in his mind, the moment when they were kicked off the plane, the way the flight attendant had acted without any real explanation. He couldn't forget the way the passengers had looked at them, some with sympathy, some with confusion. It felt like the whole thing had been wrong from the very start. He had known, even before the firing, that something wasn't right. And now, with no real answers, he was left to pick up the pieces to make sense of a situation that didn't add up. In the midst of all his anger and frustration, he found himself reflecting on how quickly things had escalated. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a matter of a single bad interaction between a passenger and a flight attendant. It wasn't just about a misunderstanding over seating. This was about something deeper. It was about power and authority, about how a flight attendant had the ability to remove a family from a plane without cause, without explanation. And once she had made that decision, the system had backed her up without asking any real questions. It was clear now that there was no accountability, no room for the family's side of the story. The flight attendant had made a snap decision, and the family had been left to deal with the fallout. His grip on the armrest tightened as the plane climbed higher, the lights of the city disappearing into the distance. He thought about the conversation with the airline representative, how Carter had told him that the flight attendant was fired because of a safety concern. But the more the father thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just the flight attendant who had failed them. It was the entire system. The airline had acted like they were simply following protocol, but there was no real transparency, no investigation, no effort to really understand what had happened. The family had been treated like an afterthought, and that was what hurt the most. For the first time, the father allowed himself to feel a sense of clarity. He couldn't just let this slide. He couldn't let the airline walk away from this, acting like nothing had happened. They needed to be held accountable for how they had handled everything, from the way they removed the family from the flight, to the way they had offered vague excuses and apologies instead of taking responsibility. They deserved more than just empty words. They deserved an explanation, and the father was determined to get it. Over the next few hours, as the plane continued its journey, the father thought about how to take action. He didn't want to just let this go and accept the company's version of events. He wasn't going to be satisfied with the vague explanation he had received or the half-hearted apology from the airline. No, this was bigger than that. This was about standing up for his family, standing up for fairness, standing up for the truth. And he knew that if he let this go, if he let the airline sweep it under the rug, then they were setting a dangerous precedent. He reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. As he scrolled through his messages, he began drafting an email to a consumer advocacy group, explaining everything that had happened, from the moment they boarded the plane to the moment they were removed. He wanted to make sure that this didn't just end with an apology, that the story didn't get buried. He was determined to get the full truth out. He couldn't afford to let this be another one of those incidents that was quietly forgotten, brushed aside by a corporation just trying to protect its image. The email was long, detailed, and full of everything he had witnessed. The flight attendant's behavior, the lack of clear answers from the airline, the way they had been treated like an inconvenience. He didn't care if it made the airline look bad. What mattered now was making sure their voices were heard, making sure that something like this didn't happen to anyone else. As he hit send, a sense of determination washed over him. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He didn't expect the airline to just admit fault and offer a perfect resolution, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when his family had been treated with such disregard. He was ready for whatever came next, whether it was a fight with the airline, a battle in the courts, or simply speaking out and raising awareness. He wasn't going to be quiet about it. The plane reached cruising altitude and the cabin lights dimmed. The father leaned back in his seat, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. His eyes closed, and for the first time all day, he allowed himself to relax, just a little. But even as the exhaustion began to take over, he knew that this story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As they approached their destination, the father made a silent promise to his family. He wouldn't let this go. He would make sure that someone, somewhere, would listen. And no matter how long it took, he would find the truth. Because in the end, it wasn't just about a bad flight. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about making sure that the people who were responsible for this never forgot what had happened, and that they never, ever treated anyone like this again. The flight landed smoothly, and the family slowly gathered their things, preparing to disembark. But as they walked off the plane, the father couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than any of them had expected, something that would challenge the airline and force them to answer the questions they had been so desperate to avoid. And no matter how long it took, no matter how hard the fight became, the father knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this story end quietly. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.